The Ark of the Covenant is not merely a lost relic. It is a sacred object around which an unnerving silence lingered for far too long. In ancient texts, it is described as an object of power, one tied to the outcomes of wars, the fate of kingdoms, and the very presence of God among his people. Men feared it. They fell prostrate before it. None dared touch it without consequence. And then it vanished. It was not displayed as a trophy. It was not uncovered among the ruins. It simply passed out of history, as though someone long ago had made certain that humanity would lose the road leading back to it. For millennia, the Ark remained at once an object of faith, a great mystery, and an almost forbidden legend. Some believed it was destroyed with Jerusalem. Others believed it had been hidden before the city fell. Still others were convinced that its trail had been deliberately dissolved into texts, routes, and fragments of memory, so that no one would ever be able to reconstruct it directly. And that was the central problem. Not the absence of traces, but their excess. Too many versions, too many fragments, too many ancient testimonies, later retellings, ruined temples, vanished names, and places altered beyond recognition. The history of the Ark had shattered into hundreds of pieces, and man could no longer gather them back into a whole. But now, something new has entered the story. Not a mystic, not a relic hunter, a machine. A system capable of comparing scattered texts, old maps, terrain features, archaeological reports, and faint correlations that for centuries were swallowed by the chaos of data. And this is where things begin to turn strange. Because when artificial intelligence began assembling this scattered history anew, the outlines of not merely a legend, but a trail, started to emerge from the darkness. Faint, incomplete, but far too specific to be dismissed easily. For the first time in a very long while, the question of the Ark began to sound not like a religious echo from the past, but like the direction of a real search. To understand why the disappearance of the Ark of the Covenant still carries an almost unsettling weight, one must first understand what it was to ancient Israel. The word relic is too weak here. In biblical tradition, the Ark was not merely a sacred object, but the place where the divine almost directly touched the human. Not simply a symbol of God's presence, but a vessel of that presence. And that is precisely why it inspired not only reverence from the very beginning, but fear as well. According to Scripture, the Ark was not created as an ornament of the temple, but as an object of a wholly different order. It held the tablets of the covenant, the very memory of the bond between God and his people. But the deeper meaning went beyond even that. In the ancient mind, the Ark was not a mute object. It acted. Its presence was linked to victory, and its loss to disaster. To stand near it was not merely to stand near a holy thing, but near a force that could not be controlled. That is why the Ark could never be treated like an ordinary possession. It could not simply be opened, examined, or touched without consequence. An entire system of distance was built around it, because the logic of the ancient world held that too close a contact with the sacred was dangerous. Thus its reputation was formed, not merely as a sacred object, but as something beside which any violation of order could cost a man his life. Yet the Ark inspired dread not only because it punished, it also signified chosenness. Its presence confirmed that the people had not been abandoned, that a power greater than kings, armies, and city walls stood behind them. So long as the Ark remained at the center of religious life, there endured the sense that the bond between heaven and earth had not been broken. That is why its disappearance became something greater than the loss of a sanctuary object. Too holy to be merely a possession. Too dangerous to become an ordinary temple furnishing. Too important to vanish without a trace. And if such a thing truly passed out of history, then the question is no longer only where it is. The question is, what must have happened for an object of such significance to be hidden so thoroughly, as though its very existence had become too dangerous for its own age? And now we come to the most important part. Because the mystery of the Ark of the Covenant rests not only on its sacred reputation, It rests on the moment when its trail suddenly breaks off in an almost terrifying silence. In the early history of Israel, the Ark stands constantly at the center of events. It appears alongside wars, migrations, temple worship, and crises of power. It is not hidden at the edge of the narrative. On the contrary, it is one of the central, holy objects of the people. But then something strange happens. The closer history moves toward the catastrophe of the kingdom of Judah, the denser the silence becomes. When Babylon rises against Jerusalem, the threat no longer appears temporary. The city is moving toward destruction. The temple, regarded as the heart of the religious world, stands on the brink of ruin. And this is where the central question emerges. What happened to the Ark at the moment it became clear that the holy object might fall into enemy hands? It is here that the theories begin. Some believe the Ark disappeared before the city fell, that priests may have hidden it once they understood Jerusalem was doomed. Others think it was destroyed or seized during the plundering of the temple. Still others are convinced the trail was deliberately erased so that no one could ever trace the hiding place directly. But the most unsettling thing is not the number of hypotheses. The most unsettling thing is that none of them fully closes the gap. If the Ark had simply been lost, history would likely have preserved a more direct testimony. If it had been publicly carried away as a trophy, that would almost certainly have remained in foreign chronicles as a sign of final victory over Judah. If it had later been found among the ruins, it would have become an event impossible to forget. But instead, what remains is emptiness. Far too great an emptiness for an object of such significance. And it is precisely this emptiness that makes the disappearance of the Ark so singular. It does not leave history in some grand, dramatic finale. It seems to dissolve at the border of war, fear, and urgent concealment. As if the people of that age understood that if this holy object could still be saved, then it had to be saved not for glory, not for future generations, but for total disappearance from the enemy's reach. Its trail breaks off exactly where it should have become most visible, at the threshold of the destruction of the first temple, at the boundary between a still living temple tradition and the world that followed catastrophe. Before that, the Ark is a reality within sacred history. After that, it is almost a shadow, almost an echo, an object of conjecture, retellings, and later traditions. And therein lies the full paradox. The more important the Ark was, the less clear its disappearance became. Which means it did not vanish by accident, or at the very least, that is how it begins to appear. Not as a chaotic loss during a sack, but as an event in which someone may have acted quickly, deliberately, and under immense pressure. It is at this point that the history of the Ark ceases to be merely a religious mystery. Because from here onward, we are no longer speaking about a holy object that was simply lost. We are speaking about a holy object whose trail may have been hidden intentionally, so thoroughly that it outlived armies, empires, and millennia. But if the Ark was truly so important, then the natural question follows: why was it never found earlier? Why, across thousands of years, did no expedition, no monastic order, no archaeologist, no empire skilled enough to pull entire civilizations from the earth ever succeed in reaching it? The problem is that the Ark did not vanish into emptiness. It disappeared inside a historical collapse. War, the destruction of the temple, the fall of the city, exile, shifting powers, and the rewriting of memory turned the last known traces into chaos. History did not preserve one clear line. It preserved countless fragments, each pulling the search in a different direction. Some traces pointed towards subterranean chambers beneath Jerusalem. Others suggested secret priestly roots. Still others hinted at a distant removal, almost at the level of legend. Over time, ancient texts were joined by later chronicles, apocrypha, local traditions, pilgrims' conjectures, political myths, and outright speculation. At a certain point, the problem was no longer that there was too little data. The problem was that there was too much of it, and that it contradicted itself. humanity always searched for the Ark in fragments. One scholar studied texts, another focused on geography, a third examined archaeological strata, a fourth followed religious tradition. But no one could hold everything together at once. Ancient descriptions, shifts in terrain, old maps, the logic of evacuating sacred objects, siege routes, later insertions into manuscripts, scribal errors, vanished place names. Too many centuries have been laid over a single mystery. That is why nearly every new seeker fell into the same trap. He would take one convincing fragment and build an entire theory upon it. But if the Ark was truly hidden deliberately, then it could not have left behind a simple trail. On the contrary, its path would have had to break apart into pieces so that individual fragments survived, while the complete picture did not. There was another reason as well. The Ark was sought as an object, as a thing, as gold hidden in the earth or sealed behind stone. But the further time advanced, the stronger the suspicion became that what needed to be sought was not the object itself, but the logic of its disappearance. Not merely a place, but a system of concealment. Not a single legend, but the point where dozens of weak signals converge. And this is where human investigation ran into the limits of its own capacity for decades. Not because people were not intelligent enough, but because a mystery of this scale had become too diffuse. Too many sources, too much noise, too many correlations impossible to verify by hand without losing the larger pattern. So the Ark may not have gone unfound simply because its trail vanished. It may have remained unfound because humanity looked at the mystery in pieces for far too long, while the answer, if it exists at all, was hidden only in their convergence. It is at this point that something enters the story which previous generations simply did not possess. Not a new relic, not a newly discovered scroll, not a sensational object lifted from the sand, but a tool capable of working with chaos in a way the human mind never could. Because human investigation has almost always followed the same pattern. A researcher would choose one line of inquiry, a text, a map, a chronicle, an excavation site, a local tradition, and pursue it as far as knowledge and intuition would allow. But the mystery of the Ark long ago outgrew the boundaries of any single discipline. It fragmented into too many weak signals, scattered across eras, languages, territories, and sources. Artificial intelligence matters here not because it sees the truth. Its strength lies elsewhere. It can compare vast masses of disconnected data without fatigue and without the human habit of committing too early to one preferred version. Ancient texts, later copies, archaeological reports, terrain features, satellite imagery, old plans of temple complexes, siege routes, the logic of concealing sacred objects. All of this existed for centuries as separate layers. For a machine, it can become a single field of analysis, a system for detecting recurring patterns and hidden correlations. And this is where the story begins to turn unsettling. Because once these fragments begin to gather within a single analytic field, the history of the Ark no longer looks like a disorderly collection of beautiful legends. Lines begin to emerge. Not proof, not final answers, but lines, far too consistent to be dismissed immediately as coincidence. Some of these convergences concern geography. Others concern the way ancient sources describe hiding places, sacred chambers, temporary evacuation routes, and zones where a holy object could have been moved beyond the reach of ordinary military search. Still others concern the texts themselves. In some places, the same motif of concealment appears again and again. Elsewhere, the emphasis shifts in ways that seem too suspicious to ignore. And elsewhere still, crucial information appears to dissolve into later retellings, leaving behind only the faint outline of an original design. A human investigator may notice one such signal, sometimes two, but once they become dozens, an entirely different picture begins to form. And that is what makes the intervention of artificial intelligence so dangerous to older assumptions. It does not bring the Ark to the surface. It does something far more uncomfortable. It suggests that beneath the layer of myth, there may be a logic. Which means the disappearance of the Ark may not have been chaos at all, but an operation of concealment whose traces still remain embedded in the data. And if that is true, then the central error of past searches was not that they looked too little. It was that they looked too narrowly. Each investigator saw only a fragment. Only now does there appear a chance to see the structure of the disappearance itself. This is the point at which the story ceases to be merely an ancient legend. Because the moment a machine begins to detect order where centuries saw only fog, the question changes. It is no longer, did the Ark exist? Nor even, where should it be sought? The question becomes something else entirely. What, exactly, was hidden so carefully in this story that humanity required a new form of intelligence in order to notice the trail again? And this is where the first truly disturbing result appears. Not a discovery, not a sensation in the newspaper sense, but something more dangerous. A direction that begins to repeat itself with too much confidence. When the scattered data is brought together, the same logic gradually begins to emerge. The Ark no longer looks like an object lost in chaos. It begins to look like an object that was moved out of danger in advance. Not in the final moment of panic, but according to a plan in which speed and chance mattered less than secrecy and knowledge of the terrain. That changes everything. Because if the sacred object was truly saved deliberately, then one must search not for traces of plunder, but for traces of organized concealment. Not where the enemy broke through the walls, but where the keepers could buy time. Not among the obvious ruins, but at points that at the time seemed too inaccessible, too sealed, or too sacred to attract outside attention. It is here that the first troubling convergences begin to appear. Certain ancient indications, once dismissed as too vague, begin to behave differently when placed against topography, older temple levels, and the logic of emergency sheltering of sacred objects. What for centuries looked like religious metaphor begins to resemble an encoded description of actions. Not a direct map, of course, but not a pure symbol either. The strangest part is that, taken individually, such signals do not seem overwhelming. Each one can be disputed. Each can be called coincidence, a later interpolation, or a beautiful interpretation. But when there are too many of them, they begin to function not as isolated arguments, but as a pattern. Faint, incomplete, yet already visible. And that pattern points to one frighteningly simple possibility. The trail of the Ark may never have vanished completely. It may only have been broken into fragments so that no one could see the whole. That is why this first result feels not like an answer, but like a blow against old certainties. If it was once possible to say that the history of the Ark had drowned in myth, now a far more uncomfortable thought emerges. What if the myth itself was the shell inside which a real route of concealment survived the centuries? From this point onward, the investigation becomes more dangerous, because the question is no longer whether the legend exists. The legend has existed for a very long time. The question is something else. Why do some of its elements align so strangely with the logic of real concealment? As though what stands before us is not merely the memory of a sacred object, but the remnant of an operation carried out so effectively that it continued to look like myth even after thousands of years. And this is where the most dangerous possibility of all begins to emerge. Not the version in which the Ark was simply lost, and not the version in which it was destroyed with the temple, but the one in which it was removed from the stage of history before the enemy even understood what had vanished. If that is true, then humanity may indeed have been searching for the Ark in the wrong place. For far too long, attention remained fixed on the most obvious points: the ruins, the trophies, the sites of great catastrophe. The logic seems simple. If the holy object disappeared at the fall of Jerusalem, then it must be sought where everything collapsed. But that may have been the central mistake, because those entrusted with saving an object of such significance would hardly have acted according to the logic of ordinary flight. They could not afford to hide the Ark near the very place that would soon become the center of plunder, fire, and total military control. On the contrary, the more sacred the object, the earlier its disappearance must have begun, before the final blow, before the city was fully doomed. That is precisely why this new version feels so unsettling. It suggests that the Ark did not wait for catastrophe within a condemned space. It may have been removed in advance, through a system of knowledge available only to a very few, through sacred passages, sealed storerooms, remote refuges, or locations that to an outsider would appear utterly unremarkable. Not a treasury, not the center of a mystery, but a place the enemy could pass by without ever realizing what had been missed. And then it becomes clear why the trail is so faint. Because what we may be looking at is not a panicked escape, but the deliberate dissolution of a route. Those who concealed the Ark could not leave behind a direct road. They had to leave only hints, clear to their own, useless to everyone else. Just enough information for memory not to die entirely, but not enough for anyone to turn it into a map. That is the strongest idea in the entire story. Perhaps the Ark did not disappear. Perhaps what disappeared was only the ability to read the trail correctly. And if that is so, then the ancient texts, later traditions, and strange geographical convergences are not the debris of legend accumulated over the centuries. They are the remnants of a concealment system, broken by time, but not destroyed. That is why the same motifs keep returning. That is why certain areas, once dismissed as secondary, suddenly begin to take on a different meaning. Not because everything there has already been proven, but because for the first time, a scenario appears in which scattered fragments begin to work together. This is the turning point the viewer should feel most sharply. All this time, we may have been asking the wrong question. Not where was the Ark lost, but where was it taken while the world around it still had not grasped the scale of the catastrophe to come. And if that is truly the case, then what stands before us is no longer merely an ancient legend about a vanished holy relic. It is the surviving trace of a concealment operation so successful that it outlived kingdoms, armies, empires, and millennia, and only now has begun to reveal itself through faint but far too persistent convergences. It is here that this story ceases to be merely a religious mystery. Because if the trail of the Ark truly survived, even in the shattered remains of texts, routes, and hidden indications, then the consequences extend far beyond a single holy object. First, it changes the way we look at ancient history itself. For too long, stories like this have been treated according to a simple formula. There is faith, there is myth, and there is reality, which can be acknowledged only after a direct discovery. But the Ark breaks that logic. If it turns out that behind this millennia-old legend there truly stood a real operation of concealment, then the boundary between sacred tradition and historical event becomes far less stable than we have been taught to assume. Second, it changes the way we regard the ancient sources themselves. Because then the texts that for centuries were read as religious memory may prove to be carriers of encoded historical information. Not in the sense that every line is a map, but in the sense that within sacred narrative, there may have survived real traces of decisions made in the moment of catastrophe. And if that is true, then part of the ancient world is speaking to us not in allegory, but in fragments of authentic memory that humanity simply did not know how to read for far too long. But the strongest blow falls against another familiar certainty. We are accustomed to believing that the great losses of antiquity are irreversible, that if an object vanished in an age of wars, collapse, and destruction, then in time it disappears completely, leaving behind only legend. The story of the Ark suggests something far more unsettling. Some things do not vanish entirely. They may be hidden so deeply and so intelligently that they outlive not only their enemies, but the very age that concealed them. And then the question is no longer only about the Ark. Then the question becomes, how many other such traces still lie within ancient history, not unfound because they do not exist, but because humanity has not yet learned how to gather scattered memory into a single, coherent picture. That is why the possible trail of the Ark could change not only religious consciousness, but historical vision itself. It compels us to look differently at archives, ruins, sacred texts, old maps, and at the very idea of loss. Because suddenly it becomes clear. The past does not always remain silent. Sometimes it continues to speak, only too quietly for the human eye to hear. And if this new logic of the search is even partly correct, then what is at stake is not merely the location of one ancient holy relic. What is at stake is the question of how incomplete our picture of the past may have been all along. And perhaps this is where the true meaning of the entire story lies. The Ark of the Covenant did not vanish. It was removed from the world of men the way one removes not merely a holy relic, but an object whose significance is too immense to be surrendered to the enemy, to chance, or to time itself. For thousands of years, humanity looked upon this story as a mixture of faith, legend, and an impossible search. But the truth now seems at once far more terrifying and far simpler. The trail did not disappear. What disappeared was the ability to see it. People searched for the Ark where everything was collapsing. Among ashes, among ruins, among the great catastrophes of antiquity. But now it becomes clear. The place to search was never the place of destruction, but the place of salvation. Not the point of downfall, but the point of a carefully prepared disappearance. And this is what the new machine has made visible for the first time. Not the holy object itself, but the logic by which it was led out of history. That changes everything. Because if the Ark truly survived, then what stands before us is not merely a lost biblical artifact. It is proof that the ancient world left behind not a myth, but a carefully concealed truth. A truth that outlived kingdoms, sieges, the destruction of the temple, the rise and fall of empires, and 2,500 years of human blindness. All this time, the trail was near. Not on the surface, not in obvious places, but within texts, routes, convergences, within the very structure of the disappearance itself, a structure no one had ever been able to assemble in full. That is why the story of the Ark has always felt so alive, because it was never a dead legend. It was the memory of a real concealment, of an act carried out in the final hours of the ancient world, when a few people may have understood that they were saving not merely a sacred object, but the most dangerous and most holy thing of their age. And if that is true, then everything we have called myth may all this time have been nothing more than a veil. A veil drawn over an object that was never meant to be found too soon. Perhaps because humanity was not yet ready. Perhaps because the trail itself was deliberately shattered, so that it could pass through the centuries and reveal itself only when a way emerged to see order where before there had been only fog. And now, it seems, that moment has arrived. For the first time in millennia, the Ark of the Covenant ceases to be merely a symbol of the distant past. It becomes once again a direction of search. Real, disturbing, almost tangible. And if this new logic is correct, then one of the greatest holy relics in the history of mankind was not destroyed, not forgotten, and not dissolved into legend. It is still waiting. Waiting in the silence where no armies reached. Waiting where the human eye passed by for centuries without seeing. Waiting not for the one who believes blindly, but for the one who will finally know how to read its trail correctly. And perhaps the most terrifying question now is no longer whether the Ark truly existed, but how close humanity has come to the moment when it may be found again.